Hello and welcome everyone to our program. Thank you all for joining us. I think this program today will prove to be a very deeply thoughtful and important conversation. I'm Hoda Mahmoudi. I'm the holder of the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland in the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences. I would like to thank our co-sponsors, the State University of New York at Oneonta and the Togetherness Wayfinder program. Also, my great gratitude and thanks to Dr. Kate Seaman, who is the Assistant Director at the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace, for organizing today's event. Thank you, Kate. And a warm welcome to Professor Dorothy Roberts, whom I will introduce very shortly to all of you. We are so delighted that we could get her to give us this talk. I'm also very pleased to be joined today by a friend and good colleague, Dr. Sheena Mason, who will be moderating our Q&A session and also sharing some closing remarks. For your information, Dr. Mason is an associate professor in English at SUNY Oneonta and is known for developing the theory of racelessness, which explores how race is a social invention that helps sustain racism. She is the designer of the Wayfinder organization, which I highly recommend that you look it up online. So that's basically the program today. So today's lecture draws from Dr. Roberts' forthcoming memoir. Actually, it's out now, The Mixed Marriage Project. And the project is a remarkable archival research that uncovers nearly 500 interviews with Black-white couples beginning in the 1930s. Through these stories, Professor Roberts offers a powerful meditation on the limits and possibilities of love across the color line and on how intimacy can become transformative only when it confronts rather than denies the structures of racism. Taken together, this work provides the foundation for today's lecture, which invites us to reflect on some of the most intimate dimensions of social life: love, family, relationship, and partnership, and to consider how deeply they are shaped by history, law, and enduring structures of racial inequality. Interracial intimacy is often celebrated as a sign of social progress, as evidence that love can transcend prejudice and that society is naturally moving toward greater justice. But today's topic asks us to look more carefully and more honestly. It challenges the confronting idea that personal relationships alone can overcome racism. This matters deeply today, at a moment when many people long for simple stories of racial progress. Professor Roberts reminds us that justice requires more than goodwill. It requires confronting both the structural dimensions of racism and the individual beliefs, fears, and prejudices through which racism is lived and reproduced, opening new ways of thinking about how intimacy and how social change take place. By examining love not as an escape from politics, but as a potential site of political transformation, today's lecture opens the ways of thinking about both intimacy and social change. So it is with great pleasure that I'd like to just introduce briefly our speaker. There is so much to say about her, but Professor Dorothy Roberts is the George A. Weiss University professor at the University of Pennsylvania, with joint appointments in Africana Studies, Sociology, and the Law School, where she is the inaugural Raymond Pace and Sadie Tanner Mossel Alexander Professor of Civil Rights and the founding director of the Penn program on race, science, and society. As you can see, she has a breadth and amazing background that's interdisciplinary and extremely important in all the work that she does and all of her research. She is a MacArthur Fellow and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, and the National Academy of Medicine. She is one of the most influential scholars and public intellectuals of our times. Really, for decades, her work has transformed how we understand the intersections of race, gender, law, science, and family life. I won't go over all of the books that she has published. You can look those up, but simply to say we are truly honored and fortunate to learn from her today. So please join me in welcoming Professor Dorothy Roberts.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mahmoudi. I am so grateful and honored to be able to give this lecture today. Thanks to the Baha'i Chair for World Peace and the other co-sponsors. And thank you also, Kate Seaman, for all your help in organizing this lecture. It is truly an honor. I'm going to be speaking about, as you can see on the screen, the Mixed Marriage Project, Lessons on Race, Love, and a Future Without Racism. Thanks also, Dr. Mahmoudi, the way you introduced this theme was really stellar, and I appreciate your remarks. So my father believed that interracial marriage was the answer to racism in America. It was still an unpopular view in the 1960s when I was growing up, but I think his faith in the power of love to overcome racism has been gaining popularity in recent years. Since the Supreme Court struck down bans on interracial marriage in 1967, the number of interracial couples has steadily increased alongside popular approval. Paul Thomas Anderson's film One Battle After Another, about a revolutionary interracial couple and their biracial daughter, just won a Golden Globe Award, and it's nominated for multiple Oscars. The movie suggests, without really interrogating it, that the characters' interracial love is tied to their radical politics. A couple on the TV reality show Love Island has a dark-skinned woman and white man as the most popular contestants on the show. So I've been told. I actually haven't watched it, but many people have told me about this. They're dubbed Nicolandria. As you can see, they're on the cover of Glamour's holiday issue. And they've prompted an outpouring of social media celebration. And they're embraced as proof that racial barriers to love have finally fallen. While watching a recent football game, I counted not one, not two, but three commercials in succession that featured interracial families. So a lot has changed since the 1960s. In the popular imagination, interracial intimacy and marriage symbolize for many people the belief that love itself has overcome the country's racist past. But does that reassurance obscure a harder truth that structural racism continues to govern even our closest relationships? What exactly does crossing a racial boundary accomplish or prove? Now, the legal regulation of family and interracial intimacy has long been a central instrument of white supremacy. As a scholar of race and family law, I've spent decades tracing how racism structures family policy and legal norms from slavery to today. The very first laws in the American colonies had to do with race, sex, and reproduction. The first officially recorded condemnation of interracial sex was the public whipping of Hugh Davis, a white man, in 1630 for, quote, abusing himself to the dishonor of God and shame of Christians by defiling his body in lying with a negress. 3 decades later, in 1662, the Virginia House of Burgesses, America's first elected legislature, passed a law that determined the future both of slavery and of racial hierarchy. I picture the white male enslavers debating what to do about the light-skinned babies born to enslaved Black women. These children were the result of sexual violence, likely committed by the very men making the law. By British tradition, a child inherited the legal status of their father, but the colonists knew that would cause a problem. If the children were classified as white, they'd have access to freedom and privilege. So they passed a law declaring that, quote, all children born in this country shall be held bond or free according to the condition of the mother. All children born to Black women would have the status of their mothers. They would be considered Black and enslavable. With that, they ensured that Black women's children, even with white fathers, could be enslaved. The law erased the family ties between white men and these children, while at the same time granting the white men power to sever the bonds between Black women and their children. So you can see in this abolitionist drawing here of baby being auctioned off to potential white enslavers while the baby's mother is pleading to keep the family together. It didn't just cement white supremacy, it made sexual violence even more profitable. White men could rape enslaved women with impunity, increasing their own wealth in the process, and any resulting offspring would be their property. Much of my work demonstrates that the devaluation of Black women's childbearing remains deeply embedded in law itself, from criminal statutes and welfare policies, which I wrote about in my book, Killing the Black Body, that punish pregnancy, to child protection systems, which I wrote about in Shattered Bonds and Torn Apart, that separate Black mothers from their children at alarming rates. But I came to understand the racial regulation of intimate life most profoundly through my own family history. After my parents died, my sister Evelyn sent me 25 boxes of my father's papers from their home. Back then, I was living in a spacious old house near the Northwestern University campus where I was teaching. As the only sibling with a basement big enough to store them, I became the custodian of this archive. For a decade, the boxes gathered dust in my basement while I continued putting off the overwhelming job of sorting through the papers they contained. But when I relocated to Philadelphia for a position at Penn, I shipped the boxes to my sociology office, and you can see the boxes there standing in front of the door to my sociology office. And I had to confront them. When I opened the cardboard boxes my father left behind, I discovered an archive of nearly 500 interviews he conducted with Black-white couples in Chicago. The first document I pulled out was a yellowed interview transcript, and the date at the top stopped me cold. February 19th, 1937. Here's an image of that interview transcript. The black edges on the side are where the paper had crumbled away. It was so old. I had always assumed that my white father began studying interracial marriages in the 1960s while I was growing up, inspired by his love for my Black Jamaican mother. As far back as I can remember, my father was consumed by this research. In the rambling Victorian house where I grew up on Chicago's South Side, the book my father was writing but never finished dominated our family life. The couples he interviewed filled our dinner table conversations, and many became our closest friends. And his hope that interracial marriage could challenge racism shaped my earliest understanding of family and love. The transcripts revealed that his mixed marriage project began in the 1930s when he was just 21 years old, a graduate student at the University of Chicago, more than a decade before he met my mother. I spent a summer immersed in the transcripts. I had planned to finish the book my father never published about the hundreds of interracial couples he interviewed, but I found that the most fascinating story was that of my parents and what the interviews revealed about them, their marriage, and my identity as a Black girl with a white father. That led me to write a memoir, The Mixed Marriage Project, which actually will be published a week from today. You can pre-order it now, but the actual pub date is a week from today. What struck me as I read the interviews from the 1930s and what I document in the Mixed Marriage Project was how thoroughly racism organized the couple's lives, even in a northern city that they'd fled to from the South, many of the Black spouses that promised opportunity and escape. At the time, most Southern states banned interracial marriage, but these unions were legal in Chicago. Illinois had repealed its anti-miscegenation law decades earlier. Yet, again and again, couples told my father the same story. Mixed marriage didn't free them from racial constraint, it intensified it. They were living through the early waves of the Great Migration, the mass movement of Black Americans fleeing the racial terror of the Jim Crow South for industrial jobs and greater safety in northern cities like Chicago. Between 1910 and 1934, Chicago's Black population more than quadrupled, and by 1940, it had grown to more than 200,000. The city's response was to confine its growing Black population to what was called the Black Belt, a narrow strip of blocks created by restrictive covenants, discriminatory housing policies, and the constant threat of mob violence. Interracial couples, including the white spouses, were typically forced to live in these segregated neighborhoods. Landlords played a decisive role. One white woman in the 1930s told my father she was promised an apartment in a white neighborhood until the landlord learned her husband was Black. Then she was told flatly, "We can't have a Negro here." In the 1950s, a Black wife reported that landlords routinely refused to rent to white men married to Black women. The couple had no choice but to live in a colored slum area near a segregated housing project. Perhaps most surprising, even white men who already owned a home in a white neighborhood encountered trouble living there if they had a Black wife. One husband, my father called Mr. Hart, told him about how when his white wife died and he married a Black woman, hoodlums would come by and throw rocks, breaking the windows of his house, and he and his wife had to move to a Black area of the city. The color line fractured families as well as neighborhoods. One mixed race family was split after the black husband died. The white mother returned to the white neighborhood where she had grown up, while her daughters, because they were married to black men, remained in the black community and couldn't safely visit her. Their brother, who was light-skinned enough to pass, lived with his white wife on the white side. It makes an awful gap between us, one of the daughters told my father. And when I read about the family, I thought about families split in two by war, like the Korean War that divided families into those that lived in North Korea and those that lived in South Korea. As the Black population grew, couples in the 1930s reported that prejudice against interracial marriage actually hardened, determining how they were treated not only in housing, but across public life. What had once been tolerated became, in the words of one white wife, a terrible handicap imposed by mounting outside opposition. Employment was equally precarious. White wives feared losing their jobs if employers learned they were married to a black man. Most hid where they lived because revealing their address in the Black Belt would signal to their employers that they shared a home with a black man. Why else would a white woman be living in the Black Belt? One wife said, "Once I had a job and told my right address, and it wasn't long, and they let me out. From then on, she hid her husband's color because she knew that her boss would promptly fire her. And she also hid her address. No white woman can hold a job anyplace if it's known that her husband is colored. They would fire her immediately," another wife told my father matter-of-factly. "It's too bad that they issue the license if they make it so hard for us." Black husbands who were already routinely excluded from better paying work in the racialized labor market also risked termination, though there were a few who reported that their bosses increased their salary when they married a white woman to make sure that their white wives were well supported. Hospitals enforced the color line with particular cruelty. Several women told my father that their black husbands avoided visiting them when they were ill, fearing the disclosure of the marriage would lead to neglect or retaliation. They don't find out that the woman has a colored husband until she dies and he calls for the body, one woman said. Now, the ones that complain the most about all of this discrimination against them for marrying a black person were white immigrant wives, because they were shocked to discover how marriage to a black man made their lives so difficult. Many had arrived in the United States from Europe expecting to be absorbed into white American life, especially through marriage to an American, because you were supposed to climb socially and assimilate more easily if you married an American citizen. So they were unprepared for the racial penalties that they experienced because the American citizen they married was black. The interviews with these immigrant wives stand out for their condemnation of interracial marriage, accentuated by the feeling of being tricked into a lousy deal. A German woman told my father, "So what's wrong if a person chooses a colored man for their husband? Had I married a Jew or any other nationality, not a word would have been said. But as soon as you take on a colored man, the world begins to think you're insane or low class." Even without an outright ban, Chicago officials retained wide discretion to police interracial couples. My father tracked down one couple to a hotel room after coppers broke up a party at their home, simply because they were an interracial couple and they had interracial mixing at their house. After several nights in jail, they returned to find they'd been evicted and all their furniture was thrown out on the lawn. Others reported that clerks questioned mixed couples and sometimes just flat out refused to issue marriage licenses. And then there was Chicago's morals court, charged with policing morality and vice. And judges there frequently treated interracial relationships as inherently illicit. In 1918, for example, Chicago police arrested a Black man, Norval Wilburn, in the home he shared with his wife, Mabel, a white woman, charging him with fornication. Judge Wells Cook, who presided over the Morals Court branch of the municipal court, sentenced Mr. Wilburn to 6 months in prison. According to the Chicago Defender, Judge Cook also ordered Mabel to keep away from Mr. Wilburn, calling him a racial slur. Taken together, these stories show how racism discouraged and punished interracial unions, not through an overt prohibition. Again, the interracial marriage ban had been repealed in the prior century in Chicago, well, in Illinois, of course, applied to Chicago. But they did it through racist structures like residential segregation, as well as through ordinary institutional decisions that determined whose families were treated as legitimate and whose were deemed suspect. Interracial marriage, in other words, was absorbed into Chicago's racial regime rather than allowed to transcend it. But it wasn't only outside structures and discretion that reinforced the racial regime. Inside some homes, and even inside the interracial spaces couples created as refuge, anti-Blackness endured. Crossing the color line did not always mean challenging the hierarchy behind it. A striking example was a social organization I had never heard of before exploring my father's research, the Manasseh Club. In the 1890s, interracial couples in Chicago formed the Manasseh Club, a social organization named after the biblical son of a Jewish and Egyptian couple. The club met regularly, held dances, and provided burial insurance and cemetery plots. I think we're seeing one here in this picture, my father on the left and a man I haven't identified on the right. But that was important because Black people couldn't be buried in cemeteries for white people, reserved for white people. So they provided their own cemetery plots. Rumors of this Manasseh Club made up of interracial couples was what drew my father through the Southside colored neighborhoods searching for mixed race couples. In fact, of that very first interview I showed you, his first question to the white wife was, have you heard of the well, he called it then the Manassas Club. He learned it was Manasseh later. And he figured that since there was this club for interracial couples, if he could find its members, he would be able to interview them and add to the number of Black-white couples he was able to identify and speak with in Chicago. Former members described how the club provided a haven from the discrimination they endured in the rest of the city. But the more my father asked questions, the more a pattern emerged. The couples admitted were overwhelmingly white women married to Black men. Black women married to white men were almost entirely excluded. Several people my father interviewed could recall seeing only 3 or 4 such couples admitted in the club's entire history. Now, it was true that there were more couples composed of white women and Black men than composed of Black women and white men. And it's possible that for some reason, white men and Black women didn't want to join the club. But there's also evidence in the responses that they gave my father, that Black women were deliberately excluded from this club. When my father pressed one white wife on the absence of Black women, she responded, most of the Manasseh women don't want to have anything to do with colored women. And then she went further to offer her explanation for why white men rarely married Black women. The morals of colored women have been looser, she claimed. They don't have to marry them. This is something I heard over and over again, that Black women and white men were having a lot of sexual relationships, but they just didn't get married. And the white women tended to blame the Black women for it, because, uh, according to them, Black women were so loose morally, they didn't want to get married. They were fine just having sex without marriage. Of course, reinforcing a long-standing racist stereotype about Black women. Marriages between white women and Black men among the couples in the Manasseh Club were revered. Marriages between Black women and white men were looked down on. What does it mean to build a refuge by reproducing the very stereotypes and hierarchies that make refuge necessary? Even more painful, my father's interviews showed how anti-Blackness shaped what many of the parents wanted for their children. In one early interview, a Black father, in fact, the husband of the white woman who was interviewed in that very first February 19th, 1937 interview, uh, cooed over his baby's light skin and reddish hair, calling the boy his little Dutchman. He's even lighter than his mother, he told my father proudly. Other parents expressed disappointment or dread when babies appeared too dark. One white wife refused to consider the children of mixed couples as colored. I always call those girls Manasseh, she told my father. Another white woman my father spoke with rejected the Manasseh Club because she was repelled by members' fixation on light skin. They acted as though, she said, quote, their children were a little better than the full colored child, teaching their children to believe a colored person can't get anywhere. The irony is that these parents try to lift their biracial children up by teaching them to see colored children, full colored children, as they said, as beneath them. But instead, that message backfired when they found out that society considered them as colored too. One white mother complained that mixed children felt the sting of discrimination more sharply than full colored children. She recalled how it pained her to reveal to her children that they were colored. People said things to them, and finally we had to tell them, she told my father, and it was a terrible shock. In these conversations, interracial intimacy wasn't automatically rebellion against racism. Sometimes it was a route to preserving whiteness from one generation to the next. Some people had married because of their partner's color, not despite it. Some Black spouses seemed to hope that marrying a white person might lighten their children. Some white spouses, in turn, sought partners with light skin, hoping their children would turn out lighter than their spouses, and many expressed the hope that their children could pass as white. As my father was leaving the home of a white doctor married to a light-skinned Black woman, he asked the wife, "Do you think you could have married a colored man?" "No, I wouldn't marry a colored man," she answered, then thought better about it. "Well, maybe I could have married a real light one, or if he was prominent." And then her husband interjected, "I don't think I would marry a girl as dark as her mother." Interracial marriage has never been the solution to racism that many Americans, including my father, have wanted it to be. Instead, it exposes how deeply racial hierarchy is embedded in the institutions that govern intimate life, and even in our own thoughts and desires. Crossing the color line wasn't the same as dismantling what built it. Love could transgress a boundary, but it could not by itself undo the machinery that produced and enforced that boundary. Yet the interviews complicated my skepticism about the power of love in the struggle against racism. The interviews also told a more defiant story. I had long imagined Chicago's Black Belt as an impenetrable boundary dividing Black and white life. But the couple showed that the color line was more porous than the historical narratives I had read suggested. There were hundreds of white spouses living in segregated Black communities. True, while love gave these couples the courage to cross Chicago's rigid color line, it could not by itself erase it. Love can cross a line, erasing it takes work. And some of the couples my father interviews did that work. Some of them did more than endure the city's racial order. They actively contested it. Rather than claiming not to see race, they described their efforts to resist Chicago's racial hierarchy, confronting racism directly rather than embracing the comforting fiction that love alone was enough. Some told my father how they challenged Chicago's injustices through activism in the Communist Party in the 1930s or the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. Several pointed to their conversion to the Bahá'í faith and practicing its principles of peace and equality. Others resisted simply by engaging deeply in the colored communities where they lived. For them, their marriages were part of a broader struggle for racial equality. What I ultimately learned from these interviews is a lesson that remains urgent today. Love doesn't overcome racism by pretending racism doesn't exist. Love becomes politically transformative when it confronts rather than denies the racist structures that continue to deny our shared humanity and govern intimate life. Structures like housing segregation, employment discrimination, prisons, deportations, and detention centers, and the surveillance and separation of families that defy unjust norms. If we want to create a world built on care and shared humanity, we must start with ourselves, even in our most intimate relationships. We can't wait until racism ends to relate to each other as equals. We have to practice that equality now, even as we continue to live in a world governed by racial hierarchy. That's something I wrestle with throughout writing this memoir and throughout my relationship with my father and the debates we had. Because if you accept the reality, which I think is true, that racism does influence our relationships, we might say governs our relationships, then we would be completely bound by it if we don't at the same time have a vision that racism doesn't have to do that, that we don't have to live that way. It's a tension. How do you live with the reality that racism does influence even our thoughts and desires about our fellow human being, but at the same time refuse to be dominated by that. How do we begin to relate to each other as equals, even in a racist society? How do we practice that equality now? We can't, doesn't even make sense to say, I'm going to wait until racism ends. Well, you have to be part of the struggle to end it. So, even as we continue to live in a world governed by racial hierarchy, how do we relate to each other as equals? We have to learn to exist within the tension of living in a racist society while envisioning a future in which racial hierarchy is unimaginable. As I wrote my memoir, I kept circling back to one fundamental question. How can we love each other as equal human beings across the very real chasm of race? A race is an invented classification system of human beings, but it's a real classification system that has been invented. It's not a natural one. I came to realize that all my own scholarship had been circling this same question. My deep grappling with racism left me skeptical that we could love one another with pure hearts, untouched by the structures that divide us, by the stereotypes that both attract and repel us. And yet, the very reason I've spent my career asking this question is because I do believe the most important lesson that my parents taught me, that we share a common humanity. I do believe we can collectively dismantle the seemingly unbreakable structures, ideas, and stereotypes that deny our common humanity. I do believe we can learn to love in a racist society. And in fact, I believe more than ever that that is essential to the future of humanity. So I look forward to engaging with those in attendance. I know that Dr. Mason is going to help with orchestrating that. I just want to show one more slide. Uh, if you're interested in more about my book, you can scan the QR code. And as I said, it'll be out a week from today. But there's a lot of information available. And thank you so much for your attention.
Dr. Roberts, I can't thank you enough for this wonderful, deeply engaging, and insightful presentation. Your
Thank you.
stellar research over the decades is really quite phenomenal. And we look forward to reading this book of yours that is about to be released.
Yeah.
So it's my pleasure now to turn the time over to Dr. Sheena Mason, who will then moderate the Q&A. Sheena.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Professor Roberts, for your enlightening and very rich lecture. I have a question to start us off. Um, in your lecture, you challenged the idea that interracial intimacy represents the triumph of love over racism.
Mhm,
For those who may still hold that belief,
mhm,
what is the most important misunderstanding you want people to let go of?
mhm. The main misunderstanding, and let me first say, I'm not questioning the love that people have for each other. It's not about that. In fact, my book is a lot about the love I have for my parents, and this isn't about questioning personal decisions about who to marry or whether you love your partner uh, whatever race your partner is. It's about the capacity of love that crosses racial lines by itself either proving that racism has disappeared or believing that just that love by itself is enough to challenge racism. So if people believe that, I would want them to consider the ways in which we know that racism structures our intimate relationships. I gave lots of examples of that from the 1930s, but we could find examples of that today as well. So it's simply not true in America that our personal relationships, including loving relationships, are immune from the impact of racism. Uh, One way in which we can see that is the kind of evidence I talked about in my lecture, where despite loving across the color line, these couples still had to live within the division of the color line. So just the very structures of where you live, um, how your marriage is treated, those still constrain the lives of people who marry interracially or love interracially. And then there is also, in a way, a more difficult aspect of it, which is the way in which racist stereotypes, racial ways of thinking that have circulated in US society since the time of slavery. I mentioned the stereotype that Black women are sexually licentious, which comes out of uh, uh, white men's wanting to justify their sexual violence against Black women. That stereotype continues to circulate in America today. And one of the ways we know that stereotypes, racial stereotypes, racist stereotypes continue to influence is dating app data. Dating apps allow people to select the race of who they're interested in dating. And we can see from it that white men, more than anyone else, exclude anybody but white women. And Black women are the least likely to be selected as suitable partners, including by a significant number of Black men. So uh, those are those decisions about who we even see as potential partners to love, who is lovable, even that's influenced by racism in our society. And so we can look historically, what has it taken? What has it taken to end racist institutions and structures and ways of thinking? Um, Not to say that they've been defeated completely. Of course not. We're still fighting that battle today. But what's been successful in reducing the power of racist structures and ideas and institutions? It's organizing, it's social movements. Now, I want to make it clear that love can be a transformative part of that. Love is, and this is why I put up that slide where some of our best thinkers have talked about Martin Luther King Jr. and Sister Teresa, Mother Teresa, and Ryan Stevenson and others have thought about what is the relationship between love and justice. And the overall message, which I also found in thinking about my father's research, is that love by itself doesn't produce justice, but love the for the purpose of justice, love on the path to justice is very powerful. And some people put it as justice is love in action. It's there is a relationship between the two, but we have to see what that relationship is and work on that relationship between love and justice.
Thank you so much, Professor Roberts. It strikes me that there's resonance between your point about love alone not being enough and the kind of thinking that we see across time and across place related to the notion that if a country is browning, right, that
Mhm.
alone is going to solve the problem too,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Uh, America has always had the contradiction of being a nation from its very beginning, uh, on paper, devoted to the principle that we have God-given inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the principle that all people are created equal. And yet, those principles were stated by men who enslaved other human beings and supported the institution of slavery. So, words by themselves, even if people believe in those words, without justice, are meaningless. In fact, there is a way in which, if you believe in words about love, about equality, about life and liberty, and all of that, but your practice is to enslave or otherwise oppress or deny the humanity of other people, you have to create a system that is especially brutal and dehumanizing. That's the paradox of a liberal democracy having slavery. Yeah, that's a paradox of a liberal democracy having the largest prison population on earth. How could that be? Because in order to claim those lofty principles of love and liberty and equality, while you're oppressing masses of people, you have to create a way of thinking and a whole system that denies the humanity of those people, because to justify treating them that way. And and that's why it seems paradoxical, but if we don't keep at the forefront the importance of the actions that it takes to truly treat people as equal human beings, all the professions of love and liberty, and they not only don't matter, they can lead to extremely atrocious behavior. And I think we're seeing a lot of that right now in this nation. Uh, and 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 that's why the message of love and justice together is so important, because I do believe that fundamentally this is about loving each other as equal human beings. I do believe that, but those are more than just words. They have to have the action of creating a just society behind them. And, as I was saying at the end, this is the tension of the the yin and the yang, the dialectical of, we need love to create a more equal society, but we need a more equal society to truly be able to love each other equally. So we have to do both. We have to do both at the same time.
Powerful. We have some questions from the audience. John says, thank you very much, Professor Roberts, for your work. I just want to ask, in this present time, is interracial or mixed marriage now widely accepted by society? My other question is, are the issues faced by mixed couples back then still unresolved in the present time? And if those are already resolved in the present time, what are the new or modern issues currently faced by mixed couples?
Mhm. Well, certainly all the survey evidence and just the evidence of the numbers of interracial mixed couples, mixed families, shows that there is more acceptance, and that acceptance has been increasing steadily since 1967 when Loving versus Virginia was decided. But I think it's also at the same time important to note, number one, it was not until 1967 that the Supreme Court held it was unconstitutional to ban interracial marriage. That may seem like ancient history to some people, but I was in school at the time. I remember that time very clearly. So I think it is very recent. And there were some southern states that didn't bother to eliminate it from their the bans on interracial marriage from their constitutions until, a decade ago or so. So it's also the case that interracial marriage is still less common than we would predict if people married randomly. So there still is a reluctance to marry across racial lines. Again, especially by white men. White men are the least likely of any demographic group to marry someone of another race. So there still is an a sense that it's wrong, and some people in the United States would still support bans on interracial marriage. Now, what are the issues? Well, one issue is the passage in Tennessee and other states of conscience clauses for people who issue marriage licenses. This is mostly comes out of the uh, um, reluctance or just the refusal of some marriage license clerks to marry same-sex couples. But I'm not aware of any case where this has come up yet of a refusal to marry an interracial couple. But as I noted in my lecture, a lot of the discrimination against mixed couples in Chicago was because of discretion given to judges and marriage clerks and landlords and others who were able to impose their prejudices, even though the law did not ban interracial marriage. So that's something to keep an eye on. And then I think, as I was suggesting in my lecture, the very fact that it's becoming more popular may persuade some people to think, well, we don't have to worry about racism in America anymore. It's like when Barack Obama became president of the United States, and all these people are saying, oh, there's no more racism in America because we have a Black president. But we could see through every measure, racial disparities in health, in wealth, in income, in housing, and incarceration, that there still is structural racism in America and a lot of racial bias on the part of individuals as well. So that's something I think we should be aware of as well, not believe that because interracial marriages have increased so much, and we're seeing them in popular culture, as I said at the beginning of my talk, that is proof that we've overcome racism with love.
What I hear you saying is something to the effect of how it almost encourages or invites a type of color blindness, which
Yeah.
then precludes us from doing anything outside of the act of loving itself, right? We
Yeah.
can't get to the structures because we have difficulty in recognizing them. Yeah, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
very good. Malik has a comment here.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. It really shows the human messiness of race, love, and intimate relationships. Do you know of a single volume which tells the story of groups like Manasa? Here in
Mm-hmm.
Washington, D.C., a group called Neighbors, Inc. was instrumental in a white flight neighborhood by bringing Blacks and whites together. In that case, interracial relationships grew from such activities.
Yeah.
In your estimation, what are the eggs today that can give rise to the chickens of messy interracial intimacy? For why should only white, and black couples deal with the trying, embracing, and beautiful frustrations of marriage? Thanks,
Yes,
Malik, for the question.
equal frustration for everybody. Okay, so that's a very good point, and actually reinforces what I was trying to get across in my lecture, that it isn't that interracial intimacy produces racial harmony or uh, gets rid of racism. It's when people are able to associate freely with each other, it's more likely that we'll see interracial relationships. And part of the reason we don't see as many as random prediction would lead to, is because there still is a lot of racial division in America. And so I like the example of um, an organization that was built to fight racism that then produced interracial couples. Um, that there were some examples of that in my father's interviews. So one group where he found a number of interracial couples was the Communist Party in Chicago, and a, a large number of the mostly white women married to black men that he interviewed were members of the Communist Party. Another was the Baha'i faith. There were a number who were drawn to the Baha'i faith and met their partners uh, while practicing that faith. And then during the civil rights movement, a number of the couples were involved in civil rights organizing and then uh, met each other that way and got married out of those relationships. So there are examples in my memoir, and I think that reflects again this question of, does interracial intimacy produce, or is it proof of ending racism, or are struggles to end racism more likely to produce interracial relationships? I think it's the latter. I think Malik was agreeing with me.
Thank you. Selvi writes, this is such fascinating research. Thank you for doing it. Just wondering, for a man and woman of any race who are married, they are bridging gender inequality. I'm just wondering if loving across inequality of different kinds is part of many marriages. All
Mhm.
this to say that the questions raised by Dr. Roberts' research are important.
Thank you. Yes. So that question, as well as Malik's question, um, brings to mind a theme that came out of some of the interviews that I reflect on in the book, which is whether when you marry someone of another race, you enter the marriage already knowing that you have to grapple with difference. As Malik said, that this is true of all marriages. Like, you have to understand that your partner is a different person. They're not you. They're not going to think exactly like you do. They don't have the exact same interests as you. Certainly there are things that make you compatible with each other, but they're not identical to you. They're differences. And could it be that when you marry someone of another race, far from having greater difficulty getting along, maybe you get along better because you enter the marriage knowing you have to deal with difference. So you don't expect that your partner is always going to agree with you. One woman my father interviewed, he called Mrs. Green, made that point. She said, before we got married, we knew we had to deal with our differences, and we figured out how to be compatible despite our differences. And so we have a successful marriage. Now, I haven't tested this out, I don't know, but logically, I can see that that might be uh, a, a, an, a route to a healthy marriage if you are already prepared to deal with difference and don't expect that there's going to be constant agreement throughout the marriage. So that's a possibility. Was there another part of that question? I feel like I'm missing something in the in that last question.
No, just their
Okay.
affirmation that the questions raised by your research are very important.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Kim writes, Professor Roberts, would you please compare and contrast the fundamental tenets or aspirations of the Manassa clubs in the US with efforts like whitening implemented in Brazil many years ago, with the fundamental messages you would like to come from your memoir?
Yeah, yeah. Well, as I said in my lecture, I was very disturbed, and I have a whole chapter I call Passing. And I was very disturbed, especially when white parents expressed a desire that their children could pass as white, and explained that they married either a white person or a light-skinned black person because they wanted them to be able to pass, or at least to be very fair, and express a preference for that. Now, I do write in the book that I can understand why there were black people who could pass as white who did that because they were trying to get access to all sorts of privileges and benefits that were denied them simply because of their race. So I don't condemn them for doing that. I can understand why they would do that. But to me, that's different from saying, okay, I'm going to deliberately try to produce children who can pass as white, because then if your children don't meet your expectation of color, they're born into disappointment. I again, I'm not trying to judge, nor can I judge intimate family relationships. They come in all varieties. But I would think that if parents have this expectation and desire about the color of their children's skin, that would shape the way they treat their children, either if their children meet that desire or don't. And I think there's something disturbing about a mission to whiten Black people, or the belief, and this is one of the reasons why, again, I'm not judging other people who might identify differently, but I personally identify as Black. And I think one of the reasons I do that is because I have such an aversion to the idea that whiteness improves on people. That whiteness makes someone better in whatever way, more attractive or more intelligent or more rational, all the stereotypes about white people that then get passed on to Black people. And I I think that is, um, I think it's supporting the all of the horrors of the invention of race and racial hierarchy. And so the question pointed to other ways that being lighter, or showing that you have some European ancestry improves. I mentioned before dating apps, and one of the heads of a dating app, OkCupid, said in a book, he wrote in a book that, oh, I'm something to the effect, I don't want to misquote him, but something to the effect of whiteness always helps, in dating apps. You're always more attractive on a dating app if you um, either are white or you have some European ancestry. And, he was stating what the data show, that white people are preferred overall, um, on dating apps. It's seen as a more desirable, intimate partner. And that, I think, obviously, some people would deny it, but I think obviously that comes from the long history of white supremacy, racism, anti-Black stereotypes that still circulate and affect us in our society today.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. I also wonder, this is from Naomi. I also
Mhm.
wonder what you think about being intentional and consistent and not perpetuating the myth of race. I find it so circular. Race is a social construct, and yet we continue to speak and operate as if the myth is real,
Mhm.
thus perpetuating the system race was created to justify and uphold. Thank you for this lecture and for your work.
Yeah, I understand the question. I think it brings up some of the questions I was asking at the end. How do we live in a racist society while we imagine a society that isn't racist? How do we work toward that vision? For myself, I absolutely believe, I think this is the truth, the reality, that race is an purely invented classification system to govern people, invented by Europeans to justify enslaving, conquering, exterminating other people. I think that's historically proven, genomically proven, proven by human evolutionary biology, all of it. I happen to have written a book called Fatal Invention just on that point. Um, on the other hand, I also believe, as we discussed, that racist structures continue to govern our society and govern globally, and that we have to continue to work to dismantle them and with a vision that we can abolish them. And so, how do we do that? I understand that some people would say, well, then we shouldn't use the word race at all. We shouldn't talk about race. We shouldn't, I shouldn't say I'm a Black woman. I should say what my parents taught me. I'm a human being. But I think that in grappling between these tensions of being consumed by race and ignoring race, we're still in between. We haven't gotten to the point yet where we can ignore the influence that race and racism have on us, as even as we work to abolish it. And so, but I don't think it's an easy question. I think that we do have to grapple with it, wrestle with it. But in one way, say race is invented, but racism is real. And how do we live our lives to always acknowledge and uh, live according to the reality that race is invented and is racist. The invention of race is racist, but at the same time, recognize the reality of racist institutions and ways of thinking that we're fighting against.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roberts. At this point, um, we're going to bring today's conversation to a close. I want to thank you again, Professor Roberts, for offering us not only rigorous scholarship, but a deeply clarifying way for thinking about race, love, and justice. What we've been reminded of today is that racism is not undone by sentiment alone. As Toni Morrison once said, we cannot will it away. Right? Ooh, and there's my alarm to do concluding remarks. It is embedded in institutions, policies, everyday practices, ideologies, all of the things. It's really structural, and therefore it must be confronted there. At the same time, Dr. Roberts invites us to think seriously about intimacy as a site of political responsibility, a space where honesty, accountability, and structural awareness matter and can happen. This lecture challenges us to move beyond comforting narratives and toward more honest questions about how racism organizes our lives, our relationships, and our ideas of freedom and justice. And it pushes us to imagine futures that are not merely symbolic, but structurally transformed. On behalf of our hosts and sponsors, thank you again, Dr. Roberts, for your time, your scholarship, and your continued leadership in these spaces. And thank you to everyone who joined us today for this important conversation. And with that, I will pass the mic back to Dr. Mahmoudi.
Dr. Sheena, thank you very much for helping us out with the Q&A session. And Dr. Roberts, of course, my absolute gratitude for you accepting our invitation to give this brilliant lecture today. There is so much that we have to take away from your lecture and put into action, especially in terms of eradicating racism. And I think there has to be ways of continuing our own education in relation to socializing generations of young children, especially starting young, about this notion that, color of skin is something, in a sense, to be celebrated rather than shunned. And I just think that we have our work cut out for us. And I know at the Baha'i Chair, we will continue to explore this topic for the indefinite future because it's not such an easy thing to overcome. So I graciously and sincerely thank you for this wonderful presentation. And I look forward to reading your book.
Thank you.
Yeah. So to our viewers, I want to just tell you about our upcoming events. There are two of them that I'll bring up today. The first one is an event we're holding at the Library of Congress called Multiculturalism and the Building of Peace: Lessons from Five Nations. These right now we have Azerbaijan, Bahrain, Kenya. What we're looking at is how societies who are challenged by different forms of diversity, especially multiculturalism, are trying to deal with this problem of cultivating multiple cultures, ethnicities, and religious communities, and how they try to move these communities towards more cooperation and collaboration. So if you go to our website, there's a whole place where you can look up events and you'll see this event has, it gives you the address, which is the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. Go to our website and under events, you will see our upcoming events. And I want to thank everyone again for joining us today. And we will continue this conversation on racism and race. Thank you again. Bye.